My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors around here, and summer has officially kicked off. I'm pumped. Kids are out of school, and we thought we would do, as a church, like a new teaching series as we head into the summer. And if you have your Bibles, we want to focus in on this book of the Bible called Romans. It's not really a book. It was a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the Christians who lived in the city of Rome. And so, if you're new to the Bible, the first 2/3, the kind of big part of it, is called the Old Testament. That's the Bible Jesus used. And then the third is the New Testament. And it starts with the 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, followed by Acts, and then this letter, Romans. And that's where we'll be for the next couple of weeks. And we want to kind of just focus in on some of these key verses and ideas of what Paul is communicating to those Christians in Rome, but really, he's talking to us about this stuff too. In fact, if you were to read through chapter 1, kind of the question that he would open up to us and ask you is, have you ever felt out of place? Have you ever felt a little awkward? Like that time, at least for my wife and I, like we went to a family costume party, but we were the only 2 adults to be dressed up in a costume. Yeah, that moment, and it was even worse because we dressed up like these 50s greasers, and so with all these other adults, it was like, are you dressed up or is that just how you dress? Like, I don't know. It was just weird. We felt stupid. But have you ever felt that way at church? Have you ever maybe visited another church? Maybe you grew up in the kind of church you just always felt out of place, or like you visited another church in another context or culture, and you felt out of place? Now, I have growing up in church, I've had tons of these experiences in my life. One of them, though, I had this amazing trip when I was 15 years old, and I got to go to Australia, and I got to sit in church services with Aborigines. Now, I stuck out, there were a lot of things that I didn't understand going on there. Again, I was 15, and like one of them, there was a number, but one of them was that the women just like breastfed all the time. They're just like always breastfeeding, and then like one lady came up to an altar call to get prayer while breastfeeding her baby. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with breastfeeding. I'm just saying I was 15. Like, I felt out of place. I felt awkward. It was weird for me. Now, I ask this to you because this is exactly what being a Christian living in Rome felt like. You felt out of place. You felt awkward. You stuck out. And so Paul writes this letter to them. Now, what's interesting about this letter, Romans, is that it's different than the other letters he wrote. So a lot of the New Testament was written by Paul, and most of them are letters that he wrote to churches in places that he had visited or lived in and helped plant or establish those churches. And so a lot of the letters you read that he wrote are these conversations where he's like reminding them of what he had taught when he was there with them. But Romans is the only letter that he wrote to a group of Christians. When we say church, we don't mean like a building in a church like this in Rome. They didn't have that. They weren't allowed to. They were a bunch of Christians meeting in homes all over the city. But we don't know who started the church in Rome. Paul had never been there yet, and so he's just writing to them. And so what we find in Romans, and one of the reasons we love this letter, is that he's far more clear in what he's talking to them about. So instead of being remember when and being a little more vague, he's more comprehensive as he talks about doctrine and theology and what this whole gospel of Jesus stuff is all about. He's going to speak to them based on just reputation of who they are and of who he is. And so for today in chapter 1, I want to focus in on one main verse. We'll read a few others from chapter 1, but one main verse, we'll add 17 in here for context. But verse 16, listen to what the Apostle Paul is saying to these Christians. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. Now, this is not a statement made on like value or who's better, but remember the Old Testament started with God's people, the Jewish people. So this all started in Israel, but now it's gone to Gentiles, which are the not Jewish people. So it's everybody is what he's saying. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. What Paul is saying is, hey, here's something you need to know about me. You don't know me that well, and I just want you to know I am not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel is the power of God to save everybody, to change not just you, but your city and your community and your family. And I'm not ashamed of the gospel because this is God's power on earth where Jesus left heaven and entered into this world, into our story, into our mess and freed us from our sin and our brokenness when he died upon a cross, but he didn't stay dead. This is what the gospel is all about. It's God's righteousness revealed to us, offered to us, that we humans could be in relationship with God, reconcile our brokenness and our messes, and that we could have grace and forgiveness. What he's saying is, hey, I'm not ashamed of this gospel because this gospel stuff is good news to everyone. And that's literally what the word gospel means. The gospel is good news. So he's saying, hey, I'm not ashamed of this good news for everyone. Now, what's interesting to understand about the context here is that when he says gospel, we all hear that as like a religious word because that's how we're used to hearing it. But gospel back then wasn't a religious word. They took this word from culture to explain what this Jesus mission stuff was all about. The word gospel was a political word. It was a word that would be used by like a new emperor comes in charge and he has a gospel, he has a good news. I'm in charge now and I'm gonna fix all of your problems. In our political system, we would call that their platform. And so here comes along these Christians saying, no, this is the gospel, the good news, that there is a king, the only king, the King of Kings, and his name is Jesus. This is one of the reasons Christians weren't super popular. See, back then you had one Lord, your Lord was Caesar. Christians were like, no, our Lord's name is Jesus. They had this peculiar kind of faith that made them stick out. And this is the story of what the Gospels are all about. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're the story of Jesus' life from his birth to his death and his resurrection. The story of how he came in, became king, and ushered in a new way of living that frees you and I of our fears and frees us of death, frees us of living in the rat race of life, trying to get everything out of this one shot at life we have. But rather to live with a different perspective, one with the hope of heaven someday, but today with a different kind of purpose and fulfillment and contentment found in a loving relationship with our Creator that calls us to be loving and full of grace for the world around us. And so Paul is saying, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now, the word ashamed is kind of a funny word. All right, when we hear ashamed, we typically think of like shamefulness or guilt. And that's not what Paul doesn't mean I'm like guilty of the gospel. The gospel is actually about how we're taking our guilt and we're freed of it. So that's not what he's saying. The other way that you think of ashamed is that it's embarrassment. So what he's saying is I'm not embarrassed of the gospel. Think about what embarrassment is. Embarrassment is unwanted attention. Right, you've had that moment where you were walking and then you trip over a crack, or worse, nothing, like you just tripped, like there's nothing. And the first thing you and I do, what do? We look around. Because if nobody saw you, it's not embarrassing. It's just funny. But if someone you don't know did see you, then it's embarrassing and you feel dumb because it's unwanted attention. Let's do this for a second, just therapeutically as a church. Turn to the person next to you and share one of the more embarrassing things that has happened to you in your life. Go ahead. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Some of you guys were ready. You were like, you need to talk about that, I guess. But I was just kidding. Paul understands that for this church, these Christians in Rome, there would be aspects of the gospel that they would be embarrassed of. There would be a tension that they would feel. Being a Christian living in a non-Christian place, there'd be this tension, this desire, because our faith, this gospel is so counter-cultural. So he knew there'd be this kind of tendency to want to hide or disappear or go unnoticed or maybe just like modify the gospel a little bit so it was like not so countercultural. Think about this, Rome, the city these people are living in. So part of the Roman Empire, this is the greatest empire in history at this time. They're in charge of everything. They are living in this city, the capital of this empire. It's the most powerful city on earth. It's one of the largest cities on the planet. It's ran and led by a Caesar, an emperor named Nero, who was a perverted and brutal man. In fact, he hated Christians. In fact, he used Christians as his kind of scapegoat for anything that went wrong under his leadership. It was like, well, that's the Christians' fault. These Christians under him faced incredible persecution. They were marginalized and ridiculed. Understand this, they had no social constructs for their faith. They couldn't pull their kids out of public school and send them to a private Christian school. They had no laws for religious freedom, nothing to protect them. All they had was their faith and conviction in Jesus Christ's death and resurrection and the call on their life to follow him, even in a culture that didn't. That's a tough place to be. But there are a number of ways that you and I can relate with this, which is why we want to talk about it. See, there's something about the Roman culture that made it hard for them, not just because they were persecuted or ridiculed. One of the reasons for that is that Rome was a very polytheistic culture, meaning they worshiped everything. For them, it wasn't a lack of religion, it was just like overly religious. They worshiped everything. Right? Rome was incredibly influenced by the Greeks and mythology. If you were to have visited Rome in the first century, you'd see many, many different temples worshiping many, many different kinds of gods. You could say that a core value to their culture was tolerance. So everybody kind of did whatever they wanted in regards to religion, worshiped whatever. Whatever made you happy, you worshiped that. And in fact, you think about it from the perspective of being an empire that's constantly expanding. The more and more people groups you acquire or conquer, the easiest way to keep the peace and rule over people is to allow them to keep whatever their religion was, which is easy when you're a polytheistic culture. You would just conquer this people group and then just invite their religion into your religion. Just worship whatever gods you want. You could worship just your gods or add all of our gods to it. The only thing they added was you have to worship our emperor as a god and you have to pay your taxes. Now this, you understand, for Christians that are fiercely monotheistic, they have this core belief that there is one true God. It made them not very popular. You find that in a culture that celebrates tolerance, that Christians were not tolerated. In fact, there are accounts of Romans accusing Christians of being atheists. They're like, it's so weird that you only worship one God. It made no sense to them. I mean, you might as well be an atheist. Christians faced a ton of pressure in this culture because of their view of God. But not just that. Rome was also a very hedonistic culture. That core to kind of their worldview was find happiness and pleasure in life. That was the most important stuff. It is hard to overstate the level of sexual immorality in Rome at this time. We are aware of some moral decline and some changes in values and traditions and all that kind of stuff, not just in America, but in Western civilization, and Christians are known for moaning about those things. But I'm just telling you, we don't even compete with the stuff that was going on in Rome. We don't even come close to the level of depravity. There was stuff that's just inappropriate to even give you examples of that these people took as commonplace and everyday practices. There were things to them that everybody just accepted as normal that today for us is illegal. And what's core at the worldview of a hedonistic view on life is that you value people who make your life more pleasurable. You value people who make your life more happy and more easy, which means if you're elderly, you are marginalized. If you are sick and disabled, you are not going to be taken care of. If you are an infant or a baby and unwanted, you're abandoned or killed. It was an incredibly self-centered culture. And then you got these Christians who hold a very different view on the value and preciousness of human life, from birth to death, who have very different standards of sexuality. And man, they stuck out like a sore thumb. Their faith was so countercultural. In this culture of Rome that's polytheistic and hedonistic, they started labeling these Christians as a bunch of prude, intolerant people. And you start to understand what it must have been like to be a first-generation Christian living in the city of Rome. The pressure that they felt, the tension and the temptation to constantly feel kind of embarrassed of the unwanted attention that the gospel brought about in your life. It changed you, and yet it made you the object of a lot of ridicule and persecution. And so Paul knew that there would be this temptation for them to hide it, or maybe just try to domesticate the gospel a little bit, to keep it just private and not talk about it or share it or let this good news and hope of the world out. Or maybe just to dilute it down and make it a little more palatable. And so if you have ever felt that tension, that's not new to you. You don't have it worse off than any other Christian through church history. This has been something that Christians have always had to deal with. In fact, there's a guy named D.A. Carson who speaks to this phenomenon that happens, where Christians feel this temptation to water down the gospel, to change it a little bit because it's just so countercultural. It always is. He calls it domesticating the gospel. He said this about it. He goes, we domesticate the gospel when we talk about God, but we won't talk about Jesus. We domesticate the gospel when we preach about salvation, but we don't talk about sin. Or when we ignore the Holy Spirit because we don't want to weird anybody out. We domesticate the gospel when we turn the message of repentance and surrender into a message of self-help. Or when we're more concerned about offending someone than saving someone. We domesticate the gospel when we leave out all the uncomfortable parts to make it more appealing. We domesticate the gospel when we start to think that the mission of the church is to make me happy. That's why the church is here, is to play music that I like and to offer programs that I prefer while sitting next to people that are like me. And in doing so, we rob it of its power. You see, this gospel changes everything, not just you, but everything. And so some of us, you understand this temptation. You have your own Rome that you live in. You feel like you go to Rome and it's work every day, and you feel like you're the only person there that believes what you believe. Or you have your version of Rome because it's your social circles or your classroom where you feel like you're the only person who believes that the Bible is true. Or maybe your Rome is you have family who ridicule you or tease you that you come here and go to church. That's part of your life. That tension is not new, and the tendency is to want to withdraw from Rome, but Rome's exactly where God's placed you to be his hope and his love and his truth. And so it's not about running away from that tension, but learning to live in it. But do you know what's worse? There are some of you, Christians, who you don't feel this tension because you only hang out with Christians. You're not being the light and salt of the world, engaged in this brokenness. We always want to run from it, and God's put us in it to show them what it's all about. No matter where you're at, I know we all have a next step to take in this. And Paul, of all people, says, hey, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And Paul is not some newbie to opposition. Paul's a guy who, when he preached the gospel in the city of Philippi, it landed him in prison. When he preached the gospel in Thessalonica, they chased him out of town. In other towns, they were so mad at him because of how countercultural this gospel he preached was. They drug him outside the city and stoned him with the intent of killing him. When he preached the gospel in the city of Athens, they laughed and ridiculed him. And yet he says, I am not embarrassed of the gospel. And the question that Paul is asking us is, how are you doing living in the Rome that God has placed you in? How are you doing living in the tension that God's placed you to be the light of the world, the expression of Jesus and his hope? How are you doing it living out this countercultural faith that you have that has very different views than the culture around you? How are you doing it not being ashamed or embarrassed of the unwanted attention that the gospel brings to your life? And Paul gives us a couple of clues of how to navigate this in the opening chapter. In Romans 1, he kind of lets us tune into some of the ways at least he was able to arrive at this place of saying, I am not ashamed. Here's the first one. I think it'll help us if we go back to verse 1. Paul says this in verse 1. Paul, he's introducing himself to these people he's never met. So Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Right from the opening, the third word's the important word when he says, I am a servant. How Paul got to this place to navigate this tension is he has this identity statement. He saw himself as a servant to the gospel. He saw himself first and foremost as a servant to the gospel, but really servant is kind of soft selling the word that he chose to use. There are like 6 different Greek words that he could have used to say servant. But really what he's saying is I am a slave to the gospel. I am a slave to Jesus Christ for the sake of the gospel. That's an embarrassing thing. Like that's the opening way of introducing yourself to people that don't know you, and you're like, hey, I'm a slave to Jesus. Because they had slavery and servants back then too. They knew the difference between those two words. They knew that a servant like you do is someone that works for someone, and a slave is someone who is owned by someone. It made me think of back in the day when I was in high school and college, I worked at Chili's. Chili's, baby. No one's gonna sing with me. Barbecue sauce, okay. I worked at Chili's for a long time and I was a server. So like my job when I'm on the clock was you ask me to get a refill, I say, absolutely. If I wasn't on the clock, I'm not gonna get you a refill probably. Right, it would be appropriate on the clock for you to ask me to get you a refill or to help with something, but it would be inappropriate, even if I was on the clock, for you to ask me to go wax your car. Why? Because I'm just a server of your food. I'm not your slave. You don't own me. But what Paul is saying is the opening of this letter is this statement of identity. He sees himself as owned by Jesus, which means I'm not on the clock or off the clock. This is just who I am. This is how he arrived at this place of being unashamed of the gospel. In fact, he would go on in Romans chapter 6 and talk more about this imagery of slavery. He says, we are all a slave to something. You'll either be a slave to your sin, which will lead you to death, or you choose to be a slave of Jesus, which leads to freedom and grace and forgiveness. He's saying, this is who I am. The gospel is not part of my life. The gospel isn't something I do occasionally or on the weekends. It is my life. The question for you and I is, how primary is the gospel in your life? Your relationship with Jesus, how primary is that? How primary is your source of identity in God's grace and in his love and his mercy and the relationship you have with him? Do you live in submission to that daily? Do you practice surrendering your life to him daily? Paul would talk about this in this letter and other letters of how he arrived at this. He began to see himself as just dead to himself. I died to myself. Right, that's how you don't get embarrassed. Dead people aren't embarrassed. Paul's realizing, hey, if you reject me, you're really not rejecting me, you're rejecting God. Hey, if you reject this message, it's not my message. It's Jesus' message. So maybe the question for you is, where is an area of your life that you need to die to yourself more? To make God more primary. That this is who you are, not just part of your life. But here's the second thing that he gives us to navigate this countercultural faith that we have. In verse 14, Paul says this: I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That word obligated is awesome. You could also translate obligated as in debt to. I am in debt to others. What he's saying, first, I see myself primarily as a slave to Jesus for the sake of the gospel. And because that is my identity, I'm obligated. I'm in debt. He says I prioritize others over self for the sake of the gospel. He because of his identity in Jesus, he prioritized other people before himself. That's how he arrived at this place of not being embarrassed. The gospel was primary. And out of that understanding of how loving and graceful and forgiving God is, there becomes this compelled by the love of Christ, is the way Paul would talk about it in other letters. He's compelled, he's obligated to love other people. If I've been so loved by God, how can I not love others? If I've been so forgiven by God, how can I not forgive others? And to say in debt, like, it sounds negative. It sounds like an unwanted burden. That's how we think of debt. When we didn't have enough money, we had to get it from the bank, and had to pay it back for 30 years. You don't rejoice in that. You're not excited about that. What he's saying is different. This is a chosen burden, a privilege. Maybe you've had this experience in your life where someone asked you to act on their behalf and be generous to somebody. A couple years ago in Ann Arbor, a friend of mine noticed that a mutual friend of ours' car was in disrepair, and in particular, his tires were in really bad shape. And so he goes, hey, if I give you the money, because I don't want him to know it was from me, it'd be weird. If I give you the money, will you make sure that he gets new tires? And I'm like, are you kidding me? You want me to be Santa Claus with your money? Absolutely, I'm in. But think about it, when I took several $100s from one friend, I was obligated. I was responsible. Like, I'm gonna make sure this happens, to make sure this happens for this person. But it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege, it was awesome. And Paul's saying that's how the gospel is in my life. Because I'm owned by Jesus, I get to serve other people. I'm compelled. How could I do anything other than try to serve and love more people into the gospel? The way we could ask this question in our life is, how are we doing it prioritizing other people above ourselves? You know, we celebrated having Serve Fest yesterday at all of our campuses. Or we have teams of volunteers that serve all over our church every single weekend. Or we try to love on our neighbors. These are all ways that we try to prioritize other people above ourselves, to practice prioritizing other people. How are you doing? at putting other people ahead of yourself. Not just focusing on your relationship with God, but what God's called you to do for the Rome that he's placed you in. But then the last thing that Paul says, and this is, I think, the most important of it, there's this identity, there's this prioritizing others, but then what he said in verse 16 is so important for us to get our heads around. We'll read it one more time. Verse 16, he said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God and brings salvation to everyone who believes." Why? Why is he not ashamed? Because he viewed the gospel as God's power, not his. This is God's power. It's not self-contained. Paul knew, I can't debate anybody into the gospel. I can't prove it to you. I can't legislate it. I can't run for emperor and try to mandate it. I can't do any of those things. It's not mine. I'm not in control of it. I'm just a servant of it. And viewing it as God's power freed him from that. What he's saying is that the gospel doesn't just describe God's power. It doesn't show us God's power. The gospel is God's power. And in understanding that, it frees us from the tension we often feel, the burden we often feel, to try to make everybody agree with us or think like us. And our job is just to live in submission to it, just like Paul did. This is where his confidence came from. It's understanding this is God's power, and it's just my opportunity, my privilege to proclaim it, to live it. And so we have to remember this as a church. This is important, that the gospel isn't relevant because it lines up with culture. The gospel is relevant exactly because it's not like our culture, because it has something different to offer and to say about whose you are and why you are here and what the greatest purpose of your life is to be lived. Which means the gospel is never going to line up with culture. So we should stop being bothered by that. It's never going to line up with the latest polls or opinions or what some celebrity will say. The gospel's power is in the fact that it is completely countercultural to what any of us would arrive at on our own, because it is the power of God and what only he can do in our life. And so it's learning to accept that and understand that, and then not be embarrassed of that, because when people come to church broken and hurting, having lived by the value and the narrative of culture and found it wanting, they need to experience something different. When people find out you're a Christian, they should experience and see something different in the way you love and the way you talk and the way you respond under pressure. There should be something different about your life because it's changed by the power of the gospel. And it is God's display to the world around you who's looking for hope and answers of how to feel reconciled, forgiven, to find purpose, to find contentment and fulfillment. You and I are God's answer to our Rome, where we live, work, and play. And so we're invited to not be ashamed. Paul's not saying it to condemn us, but to inspire us, to say, no, don't be embarrassed. It's exactly the countercultural, not intuitive, almost crazy sounding, miracle-based gospel that's the power of God in our lives. And as you and I live in submission to it, it changes us and has the power to change everyone around us. And so maybe for you today, maybe one of the reasons that you felt that embarrassment is because you've forgotten about the power of God in your own life, about how much he's changed you. Maybe for you, a struggle for you is that you're not convinced. Like you're into the Jesus stuff, you've been around church for a while, you would call yourself a Christian, but you're not totally convinced. Maybe you're not being totally honest about your doubts. Maybe God's inviting you to wrestle with him. I think about this for Paul. Paul is saying, I am unashamed and not embarrassed, because not just because he knew the gospel was God's power, but because he had experienced that power. It radically changed him. The dude went from a Christian killer to a church planter. That is a drastic career change. Because he had an incredibly powerful experience where Jesus smacked him upside the head, blinded him for 3 days, and he just had to hang out with Jesus and go, wait, I was working against you? I thought I was working against Christians. I didn't realize you are the king. And it radically changed him and convinced him of the power of the gospel. And from that conviction came this confidence to just go preach it and proclaim it and live it. I don't know where you're at today, but I know God has placed you in Rome. And he's placed you there for a reason. Not to run, not to hide, not to dilute or domesticate or change the gospel, but to live it as a display of your faith in the God whose power can change the world around you.